Welcome to WichitaLiberty TV with Bob Weeks.
Hello again, I'm Bob Weeks, your host for WichitaLiberty TV, your weekly source for news and commentary about Wichita and Kansas government and politics, broadcast on KGBT and its companion website, wichitachannels.com. Some of you may know me from my blog, The Voice for Liberty in Wichita. You can find that on the internet at wichitaliberty.org. The motto there is individual liberty, limited government, and free markets in Wichita and Kansas. And I might throw in economic freedom too as something that's very important to me and should be to you as well. I cover mostly Wichita and Sedgwick County and Kansas politics and government, although sometimes, like a little bit this week, sometimes the national events are so overwhelming, we'll talk a little bit about them as well. So my goal again is to cover things that the regular mainstream media, our regular newspapers, other television stations, I guess there still are some, and radio stations may not cover, except for I think my friend Joseph Ashby, who does a good job on his radio show covering a lot of things that you ought to know about. So Bob Weeks at wichitaliberty.org. You can find out a lot more about these stories I'll be talking about there as well. Today, I want to talk a little bit about trust in government because some of the events on the national scene really since last September and coming to a crescendo the past month or so really ought to give us a reason to pull back and think, hey, are we trusting our government too much, both at the national level and then at the state and local level, as I'll talk about a little bit later on. We know these names. You've heard of Fast and Furious. You've heard of the attack on our embassy in Benghazi, Libya. You've heard about the IRS targeting conservative groups. If you use the name Tea Party or Patriot or something like that, you're going to get some extra scrutiny from the Internal Revenue Service that a foundation, the Barack H. Obama Foundation, didn't receive. And now we've got the National Security Agency gathering data about our telephone calls we've learned, and also something called PRISM, which may be actually gathering our emails and images and things like that. So there's a lot of things happening at the national level that should give us just a cause a little bit to remember that government is not always this, panacea, the solution to everything like we were probably taught about in high school or junior high. That government can sometimes have a lot of problems, a lot of issues with trust, and we ought to take a look honestly at government and see if it's really worth our trust and do we need stronger oversight. You know, since I've paid more attention to politics, I've become aware of something called the public choice school or public choice theory in government. What this does is it applies some of the thinking about economics to the way that people act in politics, in particular your politicians and government bureaucrats. You know, in regular commerce, in the private sector, we expect that people will want to get the best deal that they can for themselves, that if you go to apply for a job, you'd like to make the best salary you can. If you buy something at the grocery store, you're happy when it's marked down on sale. If you're a businessman, you, of course, are trying everything you can do to earn a profit. But what about government? Could we assume that people who work in government and when people do business, I don't want to say do business, but when people interact with government, that these profit considerations are thrown aside and that everybody acts altruistically for the greater public good? Well, the public school of economics tells us we shouldn't feel that way. We should recognize that in public sphere, in government, the same type of incentives that work in the private sector are there into play as well. So, political decision-making, I'm quoting here from a book I'll recommend, is not a dispassionate pursuit of the public interest, but involves a struggle between different personal and group interests. Have you seen the series on Netflix called House of Cards? This is something I highly recommend you watch. It's the first television series, 13 episodes made especially for Netflix, so it's really kind of groundbreaking. But it's about a ruthless politician in Washington, Frank Underwood, played by Kevin Spacey. When you watch how he operates and the people around him operate, you'll understand that we need to be very careful about having a lot of trust in government. The self-interest of political parties, we're told by public choice economics, lies in getting the votes they need to win power and position. We see that in House of Cards. Government officials will also have their own interests. If they're an elected official, their interest is in getting elected. If they're a government bureaucrat with a budget and a staff, Very often, their interests lie in increasing that budget, increasing the number of staff, and increasing their sphere of influence and power. We also learned from public choice school that because of the enormous benefits that can be won from political process, people will spend a lot of money trying to get things out of government, special privileges. We used to call this rent sinking, economists did. Rent, that really doesn't mean much, it sounds like. I mean, you pay rent on an apartment, rent on a store, that's fine. There's a new word that's come up in the past couple of years, cronyism, which really describes, I think, much better that's going on. Public choice also introduces us to things such as logrolling, which is agreeing to trade votes and support amongst politicians so that each person's favorite project gets passed. Right now, Congress is considering the Farm Bill. And here in Kansas, an agricultural state, we say, well, we need a farm bill. But you might be surprised to learn that about 80% of the proposed farm bill is not spending on farmers and meat inspections and things like that. It's spending on SNAP, that is to say, what we used to call food stamps. How does farm bill, wheat price supports and things like that relate to food stamps? Well, the answer is log rolling. Rural representatives, Kansans, they can get urban representatives to vote for farm supports by throwing in food stamps, which are mostly something that applies to urban populations, although that may not be always true. So we have this kind of, well, it's almost an unholy alliance there that the food stamps and the farm subsidies are linked together. Here's something I read as liberal Republican Senator and ranking Senate Agricultural Committee member Thad Cochran of Mississippi recently said, food stamps should continue to be included purely from a political perspective. It helps get the farm bill passed. Well, there's an example of a rare moment of a politician being honest with voters or reporters or whoever he was talking to. We also see this with the NSA scandal. People are shocked to learn that a contractor had access, purportedly, we really don't know all the facts yet, access to so much government data. Contractor being someone who's working for a private company on behalf of the government. But what? Do people automatically turn into saints when they get hired by the government? House of Cards, if you watch that on Netflix, or if you just look and really read what's happening, you'll learn that that's not true at all. Well, I see we're up in time for our first commercial break, so let's take a couple moments off. When we come back, we'll see about trusting our local government here at the state of Kansas and Wichita level.
Wichita Liberty TV will be right back.
Well, welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm your host, Bob Weeks. In the first segment, we talked about should we trust our government and some of the ways that public choice economics tells us we really need to be careful about the trust that we place in our government officials because they respond to motives, economic motives, just like the rest of us do. Applying that a little more closer to home, when we talk about Kansas schools, boy, we ought to be able to trust our schools, shouldn't we? Many people have a very romantic, homespun apple pie ideas about school. And after all, we place perhaps our most precious asset in the hands of the public schools. That is our children. And even if you don't have children, it's still a very important part of our public fabric. And also because in Kansas, at least, we spend roughly half of our general fund spending on our schools. So schools are important. There's no doubt about that. And you may have heard recently that with the new budget in Kansas and a new tax plan, that there may be less spending on schools, or at least that spending on schools will not rise as fast as those who would like for it to do. And we're told that this new tax policy we have will lead to a lessening of standards, a lessening of quality of Kansas schools. Well, I have to tell you that we already have low standards in Kansas schools. We have a test called the National Assessment of Educational Progress. That's a test that's put on by the National Center for Education Statistics. It's the same in all states of the Union. But then each state also has their own state scores. These are what states use to say we're doing better, we're doing worse, our students are better than those in Oklahoma or Nebraska or whatever. In Kansas school leaders are proud of the rising scores that Kansas students show on these state-administered tests. But what NCS does is they map the Kansas standards onto the national standards, trying to get an idea as to whether each state is giving itself high standards or whether they're giving its state low standards. You know, the news for Kansas is bad. Kansas has low standards for its schools compared to other states. There's a chart you may be able to see right now that shows when we take a look at the states, only 7 states have lower standards than Kansas does for 4th grade reading. Now, for 8th grade reading and for mathematics, it isn't quite as bad. But in no area does Kansas have standards higher than the average state. Kansas has low standards. But despite that, Kansas school superintendents last year penned an editorial for the Wichita Eagle newspaper that said, historically, our state has had high-performing schools, which make Kansas a great place to live, raise a family, and run a business. But the situation is actually worse than that. Not only does Kansas have low standards, at the same time we're being told we have high standards, the standards in Kansas schools are getting worse. Between 2005 and 2009, standards in many Kansas academic areas actually slipped. And you may remember that that was a time of increased spending in Kansas schools. In 2005, the Supreme Court ruled that in favor of school districts who had sued the state of Kansas and said to the legislature, you're not spending enough on Kansas schools. And the legislature had a special session and they voted more spending for Kansas schools. Later events, the recession that started a few years later, caused Kansas to pull back on a little bit of that spending, but there was more spending on Kansas schools than there would have been otherwise. But according to the NCS state mapping study, Kansas reduced the rigor of its standards during that time. For example, although no substantive changes to the reading assessments from 2007 to 2009 were indicated by the state, the NAEP scale equivalent of both grade 4 and grade 8 standards decreased. Well, that's a lot of maybe technical bureaucratic language. The important thing to remember is that Kansas made its tests easier so that students would appear to score higher. For math in Kansas, the situation wasn't as bad. And Kansas is not alone in doing this. Many states weakened their standards. Part of it's in response to pressure by the No Child Left Behind law, something that we may get rid of before too long. States were under a lot of pressure to show increased student performance, and many states, Kansas included, took the easy way out and lowered the standards that they hold their students for. At the same time this was happening, our state education commissioner for the state of Kansas, she took to the editorial page of the Wichita Eagle and other pages and wrote this: one of the remarkable stories in Kansas education is student achievement. For 10 years straight, Kansas public school students have shown improvement on state reading and math assessments. Well, the assessments she's talking about are the ones that she, at least the state of Kansas, controls. On similar tests that are controlled by the federal government, well, they concluded that Kansas actually reduced its standards, made its tests easier. So here we have school superintendents saying Kansas schools are great. Our state superintendent of education says Kansas has historically strong standards, yet objective look at the data tells us that Kansas has not been doing well and that its standards have become progressively less rigorous. So we'd like to be able to trust our schools. We'd like to be able to trust the leaders of our schools, in particular the administration. But there's some data right there that shows that we have some trouble understanding and believing what these people are saying to us. When we come back from our break, we'll take a look at some policies, some information given out by the City of Wichita. We'll see if we can trust our Wichita officials and if we should give them a lot more trust.
You're watching Wichita Liberty TV. We'll be right back. You're watching Wichita Liberty TV.
Well, welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, your host. In our earlier segments, we talked about government trust at the national level, at the state of Kansas level involving our schools and how well our students are really doing, or really it's more about how well the administrators say the students are doing. Well, let's take a look right here in Wichita and see some recent incidents about our Wichita city government, and let's see if we can really believe some of the things that we're being told. And it's not so much that these city people are lying to us, sometimes they're just not giving us the whole story. For example, you've probably seen that Southwest Airlines is now in Wichita, Kansas, and city leaders are proud of that. They think that having Southwest Airlines in Wichita is going to have a whole lot more economic benefit and jobs and things like that. So yeah, there's no doubt about it that having a wider variety of options available for Wichitans to use at the airport, that's better than less. Abundance is better than not, than scarcity. But what the city officials don't really tell us is that at the same time Southwest Airlines arrived with 5 daily flights, AirTran Airways left with its 3 daily flights to Atlanta. That's a little more complicated than that because AirTran's being absorbed into Southwest, but where we used to have 3 daily flights to Atlanta on AirTran, those are now gone. Does that have an impact? Well, sure it does. I looked up and around 9.7, I believe, is the number percent of the passengers each day or each year in Wichita Airport flew on those AirTran flights to Atlanta. Now those flights are gone. So yeah, it's good that Southwest is here, but also bad, I think, that the AirTran flights are gone. But what really gets me is the City of Wichita leaders are telling us that the arrival of Southwest Airlines is going to have great economic benefit. Wichita State University's Center for Economic Development and Business Research prepared a forecast that projected traffic increases of around 35% and the creation of 7,000 jobs in South Central Kansas due to the arrival of Southwest Airlines. Well, that's a lot of economic activity and a lot of jobs. It would be great if it would happen. But we have to remember that at the same time Southwest came to Wichita, the AirTran flights left. It's hard to see how merely a change from one discount airline to another would have such a big impact. But the problems at the airport carried on a little bit. You know, this spring, Wichita, Sedgwick County together, they created what they call a community investment plan, and Wichita State University developed a survey to ask the Wichita people, South Central Kansas people really, what they thought about the economy, what should we do to get things going a little bit better in South Central Kansas. Well, one of the questions that the participants were asked to work with was this: local governments should continue to use public resources to encourage airlines to increase the number and reduce the cost of flights through Wichita Mid-Continent Airport. Well, you know that we do pay a subsidy to airlines like AirTran and probably Southwest Airlines in order to persuade them to have service in Wichita. And the question is, should we continue this subsidy program in order to lower fares and increase the number of flights? Well, the subsidy probably has worked to decrease the fares that we pay in Wichita. But what about the number of flights? Well, here's a chart that I've been keeping up for several years that shows the number of flights available every day or month or year at the Wichita airport. And for the past 2 or 3 years, at the national level, the number of flights that airlines are offering is pretty much level. But the trend of flights available in Wichita is declining. Now, everybody prefers a low airfare to a high airfare, no doubt about it. But at the same time, especially for business travels, the availability of a flight at any fare may be what's most important. So here we see government intervention working to reduce the price of airfares, at the same time reducing the number of flights that are supplied. Do Wichita city leaders tell us this? No. As a matter of fact, they gather public opinion based upon facts that are contrary to what I've just told you now. Here's an example that's really troubling. Early this year, the city voted to give the Ambassador Hotel in downtown Wichita an economic development incentive. Now, I thought when I looked at the numbers that this incentive should not be awarded because it didn't meet a threshold that the city wants economic development policies to have. In this case, the cost-benefit ratio for the city's debt service fund. And I had known about this for a while, and I talked about it to the city council the year before. But nonetheless, in April, the city brought this up, and they were going to vote the final awardance of this incentive. So I was prepared to go to the city council and call attention to the council members, again, that this does not meet the criteria that you set out for yourself. But before I could speak, city officials told council members that, well, we've decided in this case that this policy really shouldn't apply. And I felt bad because I thought, here's something about city policy I should have known about, but I didn't. And I also felt bad that I possibly let down my political allies who rely upon me to know these things about city policy. So I felt bad. The next day, I said, okay, I'm going to learn about this economic development policy. I asked the city for documents that explained this policy, when it was adopted, what it means, things like that. Well, after several days of searching different staff members at City Hall, the answer was there's no such document. I can only conclude that this policy was formulated on the fly in order to benefit this particular applicant. Now, this is at the same time that the city says we want to be open and transparent. We want to have rules that are known by everyone, rules that anybody can use in order to figure out, can I apply for incentive at Wichita City Hall, or do I have to do, well, the cronyism that we talked about earlier. The Ambassador Hotel, some of its developers are very heavily invested in campaign contributions to Wichita City Council members. Matter of fact, you may be looking right now of a picture of Wichita Mayor Coral Brewer on a fishing excursion with the Chief Executive Officer of Key Construction, which is one of the owners and the builder of the Ambassador Hotel. Does the fact that the Ambassador Hotel owners and others involved with it make generous campaign contributions year after year to nearly all city council members, and as you can see, is obviously a good friend of Wichita Mayor Coral Brewer, did that have anything to do with the city council willing to overlook their own policies that are meant to protect the citizens of Wichita in the dishing out of economic development incentives? I don't know. I don't know if we can ever really tell one way or the other. But when City Hall asks us to trust them, when the mayor, when city council members say trust us, we have your best interests at heart. These are some of the things I want you to think about at Wichita City Hall, at the Kansas State Board of Education, and as we've seen earlier, at the federal level. Well, I think that's about all we have time for this week on Wichita Liberty TV. Again, I'm Bob Weeks, your host. My blog is The Voice for Liberty at wichitaliberty.org. Tell your friends, sign up for the newsletter, leave some comments, and we'll see you next week.